70, and you are watching Recovery X, where experts, thought leaders, and people in recovery meet to exchange information, educate the public, and help solve the problem of addiction. Today, I'll be speaking with Cassidy Cousens from One Method Center in Los Angeles, where he is the founder, and we'll be talking about the issue of how to find a drug and alcohol rehab and how to avoid bad actors and bad rehabs out there, because it's a really big problem these days. So, Cassidy, what's going on, man?
How are you? Good to be here.
Doing great. Thank you so much for joining me. So, yeah, let's talk about how to find a rehab. I guess, first of all, what do you think is the first place that a parent or somebody who's trying to get their loved one into treatment would look for a rehab, and what are they likely to come across?
Okay, so I mean, the data is pretty straightforward. Right now, about 70% of people that are enrolling in a treatment center are finding something online, which is actually sort of one of the problems that you and I have been talking about for a couple of weeks, and how to approach this question, how to help someone choose a treatment center. And I've actually had a real ethical dilemma with this particular interview for the last couple of weeks, because it's such a complex issue. And I think that, one of the things that's come to light, obviously, this week with the John Oliver show and, just other things that have been going on with NBC and, all this sort of opiate crisis information that's sort of hitting the news cycles, is that it's pretty clear that there's rampant fraud, that there's unscrupulous actors, that there's essentially programs that are doing harm that are supposed to be doing good. And that's a problem. So it's tough to talk about, because as soon as you talk about it, you're sort of in this circle where a lot of the people that represent themselves as extraordinary programs, and I don't mean to speak negatively, but a lot of the folks that have accreditations and have the licenses and certifications in their respective states are not doing things in a way that is legal, that's in the person's best interest. And so it gets incredibly complex to try to navigate it. So I think I have a way to do this that's pretty simple, and we can kind of walk through it and figure out how to help a family member essentially choose the right program or a safe program.
Sure. That sounds great. I actually didn't know that 70% of people turn online. That's a huge amount of people, especially given
it's underreported. They think it's actually between 72 and 75%.
Yeah. And like we saw, I don't know if anyone watching actually saw that John Oliver Last Week Tonight episode. If you didn't, check it out on YouTube. It was really good. And as he mentioned, once you go online to find a rehab, you're likely to come across websites that are not necessarily clear and authentic about which rehabs they work with, and might just be promoting, one rehab in particular, stuff of that nature. Do you have any other examples of that?
Sometimes when you're calling one of those review sites, you're going to be directed into a call center, and you're not actually speaking with the specific program. A lot of the actual commercials that you see on the television, those are essentially call centers that are spending millions of dollars a month to get someone to call in, and then sending that to someone that pays them. So they're not vetting the programs that they're referring to. They're essentially saying, this person is paying more for this call, so we're going to send them to them. So what we did, obviously, let's talk about what the solutions are. So
definitely,
what in the show notes, you and I are going to place all the things to look out for. So we're going to talk about urine fraud in the show notes. We're going to talk about what's happening in South Florida. We're going to talk about unscrupulous actors. We're going to talk about all the dangers. And you, as a family member or a loved one or someone seeking treatment, your obligation is essentially to educate yourself to make sure that you understand what those pitfalls might be. Now, the way that I sort of look at it is, the most important thing is to recognize that when we're in crisis, as human beings, our sort of executive functioning is intensely diminished. And so when we're in a stressful situation, what tends to happen is we don't make the best decisions. And so, when you're seeking a treatment center and your loved one is in a terrible position, one of the challenges that you're faced with is how to make a proper assessment of the situation without getting overwhelmed and just sort of deferring to someone who may or may not be able to best understand your situation and support your son, daughter, father, cousin, friend, whomever it may be. So
Right.
the first thing is just to recognize that, like, in crisis, one of the important things to do is to really sort of slow down and take deep breaths and use your intuition, right? Like, I don't care if you call a call center, and I don't care if you call off a commercial online, and I don't care whether you search online and find this video and make a few phone calls. Like, that's not the concern. The concern is when you pick up the phone and you make the call, are you using your intuition? Are you feeling what's happening on the other side, in terms of, do you feel like they're actually interested in helping your loved one, or is their first question is, what's your insurance?
Yeah, right. And then the next question is, can we pay for you to pay for your plane ticket to come down to treatment?
Right. And we'll talk about that. I mean, the reality is that, so if a program says that they're going to pay for your plane ticket, they're at worst committing an illegal act, depending on the state that they're in. And at best, they're committing insurance fraud. And
what exactly is going on in that situation? Why is that insurance fraud in some cases?
It's an inducement. So you're not paying for a person that doesn't have an insurance benefit to fly to your program.
Right.
You're paying for their insurance benefit. As a matter of fact, you can say whatever you want to say. At the end of the day, if they didn't have insurance, more than likely you wouldn't do that. So the insurance company sees that as a form of fraud. And right now, about 20 plus states actually see that as an illegal act. We're working on that in California right now, actually, legislatively. But, recognize that you're in crisis and don't lose touch with your intuition, right? So that's what the first step is. The second step is, in all honesty, you have to get an assessment. You have to speak with an expert. And I don't know why more people don't do this, but let's just think about it for a second. Like, call someone that is in your family or a friend that's a psychologist or a therapist or a drug and alcohol counselor or works in the field or is a doctor, that can at least start a process of educating you or doing a general assessment of the situation to figure out what your loved one needs. Because this is an interesting fact, but the reality is that, a lot of people that call me, they don't need to go to method. Like, they're in a complete crisis, and in having a conversation with them and sort of evaluating the situation, they may be more appropriate for individual therapy.
Right.
They may be more appropriate for outpatient treatment. They may be more appropriate for medication-assisted treatment. But by no stretch of the imagination is that a common occurrence for people that are calling into a drug and alcohol treatment center. I mean, the reality is that most people that are calling a drug and alcohol treatment center, if you were to look at where that phone ended up, they would be in essentially a boiler room. It would be people that were literally hitting a bell every time they got an intake, because the call was a commodity and their only agenda was to convert them to a paying customer.
Right.
Nothing to do with assessment, nothing to do with what's in the person's best interest, nothing to do with whether or not that's the right modality. So, we had talked about what John Oliver had brought up this weekend 3 weeks ago with the success rates and all the hooks and the misrepresentations and all that kind of stuff. So if you're in crisis, ask for help. Don't necessarily make a call to a treatment center unless you're competent or confident that treatment center has been referred to you by a healthcare professional that sort of knows what's going on the ground.
What sort of healthcare professionals should people be seeking out? Who's qualified to make that assessment or that referral to a good program?
So it's interesting, right? So, like, you'd think you'd immediately say, well, doctors, right?
Most people, yeah.
Doctors in their entire schooling only get an hour of addiction study.
Yeah.
I mean, think about that, like an hour of addiction study.
Not good.
No, just, if you're an endocrinologist, you don't necessarily have an area of expertise when it comes to behavioral health. So a lot of times it's going to be someone like a psychologist or a therapist or an MSW or a drug and alcohol counselor. Even like the low end of the totem pole is kind of like me. It's not someone who necessarily has all the credentials and the PhDs and the doctorates that's going to be able to do this for you, so you don't have to spend a lot of money. Obviously, if you call us, it's going to be a free call. If they talk with you, it's going to be a free conversation.
Absolutely.
But let's say worst case scenario, they spend $300 on an evaluation. Well, $300 to get into the right program, I sort of think about this stuff, and there's these abysmal success rates, which we know federally are evaluated based on programs that are accepting federal funds, right? So we know, this is what we know. We basically know that in federally funded programs, the success rates are about 20% with a 4% variance. So it's basically 80% of the people are relapsing, right?
Wow.
So we know that the success rates are abysmal. And we also know that there's a very strong likelihood that it's almost like people, that the most important part of treatment isn't treatment. The most important part of treatment is pre-admission, right? So during pre-admission, hopefully you're doing an assessment and researching to find the right program so that you don't end up in a situation where I'm like, I want to go to Brooklyn and I end up, in Texas. Literally, like people don't even realize they get on the treatment train and they head in the exact opposite direction of where they need to go. And it's because they didn't get an assessment, they didn't get an evaluation, or they entrusted themselves to someone who only sees them as a commodity, that they're someone that's going to pay them money and that's the most important thing to them. So an impartial evaluation is critical in order to head in the right direction when it comes to treatment.
Absolutely. In your experience doing these sort of evaluations, what sort of criteria are you looking for to see if somebody is a good fit for rehab or even for One Method Center or a different rehab? What are you looking at exactly?
Well, let me give you like a really common example is I get a call from a family member and they tell me everything that's sort of going on with their son or daughter or uncle or aunt. And maybe 20 minutes into the conversation, I'm sort of listening and getting a sense of what's going on. I say, have you spoken to them? Do they know that you're calling? And they're like, no, I haven't talked to them. And I don't think I'm going to talk to them. I just wanted to figure out what sort of treatments were available. Well, that's great. But, the next question is going to be, do you think they would be willing to go to treatment? And 9 times out of 10, they're not. And what they actually need is an intervention. They need, it's either a familial intervention or a professional intervention. They actually need to get motivated to go to treatment. Another example would be, a lot of times, and it's kind of interesting. There's a big plug right now that, there's a prevalence of co-occurring disorders with those that suffer from addiction, right? So we know, again, these are 60% of the people that have an addiction are going to suffer from some sort of co-occurring disorder. And that's an underreported problem. It's probably much higher than that.
Co-occurring disorders being like depression, anxiety, other things of that nature.
Disturbances, bipolar disorders, schizo, all these different things. So a lot of times people actually look at it, and it's easier to see depression and anxiety and bipolar disorder than it is to see addiction. And so they almost want to go the opposite direction of what is probably most necessary right now. And why do I say that? It's not because the depression isn't contributing to the addiction. It's because they're using high-grade fentanyl. And if they continue to use that and mix it, they're going to die.
Right.
So first priority is to get them, physically sober. And once that's done, properly assess and evaluate whether or not they need to be on medications or they need depression treatment. That's sort of a formal process that's ongoing. So a lot of times, family members, they just don't know what they're looking at. So that's one facet of it. The other piece is that, we talked about this a few weeks ago and we said sort of everything looks the same. You know? So here's a great question. I'm going to give some questions that people can ask facilities. So everybody says that they do evidence-based treatment. So ask a program, what is evidence-based treatment? And you want to know something? They don't even know. This is kind of what John Oliver brought up. 10 years ago, all of a sudden, equestrian therapy became the go-to modality in high-end settings, meaning programs that cost over $60,000 a month,
Yeah.
as the preeminent technique to treat addiction. Now, I don't mean to be disrespectful, but if fondling horses, which I happen to think is a neat thing, right, somehow cured addiction, don't you think that like there would be horses on every street corner that every addict could go up to and pet and suddenly be cured, right? There
One
was
can
no
dream.
evidence. There was
Yeah.
zero evidence. But people say it's an evidence-based treatment. After it was horses, it was wolves. I swear to goodness, you started to pet wolves, and that was going to cure your addiction.
Why do you think these sort of things are being presented rather than more evidence-based, like actually studied sort of methods?
Because the more you charge, the more hooks you have to have on the line.
I see. So it's like a gimmick, sort of.
It's a gimmick. And that's not, just so you know, I actually have an intense amount of respect for equestrian therapists. I actually think that as an experiential activity, it's extraordinary.
Right.
I don't think that it's worth an extra $30,000 in treatment.
Right.
For example, I take the clients here on horseback rides. I think that it's an extraordinary superordinate activity. Well, what is a superordinate activity? A superordinate activity is an evidence-based treatment. An evidence-based treatment is something that has been researched and proven to be efficacious in the treatment of something specifically. So what is the evidence behind going horseback riding with a group? Well, the evidence is that as a community, people bond over this activity and feel a sense of belonging and purpose. And that being entwined around the treatment process shows itself to be efficacious in supporting people being able to recover. That's evidence-based treatment. It has to be essentially research-driven, shown to be effective. It has to be expertly diagnosed, meaning someone's got to actually evaluate it and say, Dan has depression, and here's the best treatment for it. And then the third pillar, it has to be preferential to the patient. So if I have an evidence-based box that's A, and the patient has a need that's C, my evidence-based A won't work for patient that wants C.
Right.
It has to not only meet their needs clinically, it has to meet their belief systems and their preferences. So, point of all this, call up a program, one of these call centers that you find online or something, and they say, we have evidence-based practices. Say, what does that mean? They'll get so tongue-tied, they won't even understand how to answer the question.
I think one of the other things I hear commonly along those same lines is that people think, and in some cases it's true, you get sent to rehab and they just give you an AA big book, send you to some meetings and send you on your way, and don't really add too much clinically on the other side.
Yeah. I mean, so here's an interesting thing, right? So we call that the Minnesota model of treatment. So it's introduction to the first three steps. And, I don't intend, I'm not here right now. This is why I was struggling so much, because obviously you see I'm pretty passionate about it.
Yeah.
I take intake really, really seriously, both on a personal and professional level. And it's really challenging to see all the things that are going on. But if you sort of step back and look at it for a second, there is evidence that tells us there are multiple modalities for someone to get sober through, right? The most effective of all of them is called an integrated model of care.
Okay.
The integrated model of care is a bunch of different techniques in one treatment setting. So they don't just do the Minnesota model. They actually do a little bit of MAT. And they don't just do cognitive behavioral therapy. They actually do a little psychodynamic therapy as well, right? There's all these different things. And then as the client starts to respond to one or two or three forms of treatment, they increase the frequency of that treatment, right? So they identify what is working, and then they increase the frequency of that intervention. That's the integrated model of care. Well, again, ask a program, do you offer an integrated model of care? And people will be like, what's an integrated model of care?
Hmm. Would
We have
most
the most amazing
programs,
program.
even good programs, would they know what that is for the most part, or would you say that's sort of the standard that of a quality program?
I do. I do
Mhm.
think, and so this is something that I wasn't going to say. Again, this was a real dilemma for me, this interview, I'm
Yeah.
telling you, because I've been doing intake for almost 20 years, and I've seen just craziness in the last, I'd say, 5 years. It's almost intolerable. But so as a professional, as someone who's intimately involved in mental and behavioral health, I would tell you that there's probably about 24 programs that I'll refer to nationally. And there's about 14,000 programs in the United States. Now, I don't obviously know all those programs,
Right.
but I know a lot, a
Yeah.
real lot. And even some of the most well-known programs, internally, they don't have anything like an integrated model of care. It's really
Hmm.
sort of turn and burn beds, right? Like bring them in, churn them out, bring them in, churn them out. And that's exactly the opposite of what most people need.
Yeah, absolutely. So any other questions they should ask while they're researching in this sort of research phase?
Yeah, I think you need to go back to, you could watch the other videos that we did, but I think they need to ask, what is their success rate?
Right.
Because if they report a success rate, remember we told them you need to hang up the phone. Um, it's an irrelevant statistic that's designed to hook you in. There's no
Yeah.
guarantee that a program is going to be 60% successful, 80% successful. It's just ridiculous.
And those
Um,
success rates are going to vary. The measure for the success is going to vary from treatment center to treatment center, and sometimes uh, the only research they're doing into that is just calling the former patient and saying, "Hey, are you still using or drinking?" And a lot of times the patient will lie. So those are, yeah, like you said, very meaningless numbers in many cases.
yeah, completely. And it's all telephonic follow-up because they're not in the
Hmm.
program anymore.
Yeah.
I do think that it's important to ask what the financial policies are. So, do you have a refund policy? Do you waive deductibles and
Hmm.
copays and my responsibilities as a patient? Um, it's important to know that stuff ahead of time. And if someone tells you we're going to waive all your fees without asking for a tax return, just know that they're probably functioning on fraud.
Hmm.
That, for example, I'm willing to treat just about anybody that meets criteria at Method, regardless of ability to pay. And if someone tells me, well, I want a scholarship, you know what my question is? Can I see your last 3 years of tax returns?
Hmm.
It's not to be disrespectful, but it's like if you're telling me that you really can't pay the $400, I
Yeah.
need to see proof of that, because the reality is that it's fraudulent for me to bring you in without meeting your personal responsibilities. And programs that are willing to waive those fees are often the same programs that are flying people out to treatment.
Hmm.
Um, it's illegal. And so if the program's functioning illegally, it,
Yeah, you can't have much hope for the quality of care if
no.
their marketing practices and intake is illegal.
Correct. Correct.
Yeah.
So I think asking about the success rate, asking them what their financial policies are. Another question is, and I encourage a lot of family members to do this, is to ask for an explanation of the program. So let's say that they pass those litmus tests, right? Well, talk to me about the program. Tell me about the daily schedule and sort of what happens and how many sessions I do and who those sessions are with. And the person on the other end of the phone is going to explain all this to the family member. Well, then ask it to be put in writing. They say
Right.
we're going to do 2 sessions per week. We're going to do 5 sessions per week. Okay, put it in writing. Is that something that you're willing to actually say ahead of time that we're going to do? And again, as soon as you ask these questions, a lot of these programs, it's like you've peeked behind the curtain. They know it. And if they don't just immediately hang up the phone, they're like, well, we can't put anything in writing. What thing costs 50 grand that you can't have a pre-contract review with?
Right.
I mean, what place in the world are you expected to pay that kind of money, sight unseen, based on a conversation? It's
That's pretty
ridiculous.
wild. Yeah.
Yeah. And the question is, and we're sort of asking this, well, why would people do that? People do that because they're vulnerable. They're in crisis. Their loved one is desperate. They're desperate. They need help. They're not thinking
Yeah.
completely about all of these questions. And so a lot of these unscrupulous operators, they take advantage of that. And it's really unfortunate. And that, again, this is the dilemma, is I don't want to be a negative Nancy. I don't want to demean an entire field, but I've worked in this field for so long. You're the first person I've done interviews with, and I've been asked by actual major networks to work with them.
Hmm.
And the reason was because you were doing it on a grassroots level. You were
Right.
like, let's educate people, not to, out us both, but we both appreciate our recovery processes and we want to help as many people as possible. This is completely different than what most people find out there.
Yeah.
And, so you gotta, as a person researching the process, you gotta use your intuition and sort of feel that out. And then, listen to your intuition and make decisions that are rational.
Yeah, it's hard. I mean, especially, if you're relying on intuition a lot of the time and you have no prior frame of reference for this kind of thing, you don't know what somebody on the other end of the phone is supposed to sound like. So these questions sound normal. If the first question is what's your insurance, and this is the first phone call you've ever had, then you might think that's just totally legit.
Yeah.
So
I mean, you want to hear something interesting? So,
yeah.
I get a lot of calls, right? And most programs have what they call like a lead gen system or some sort of like way of managing their leads internally.
Yeah.
And what they'll do is they'll essentially, and I worked in large institutions that did this. This is how I know this. And what they'll do is they'll sort of put these callers on rotation, right? So let's call them back in 12 hours, 3 days, 1 week, 2 weeks. And what they're trying to do is just get those people into their program, essentially convert that call into an admission, right?
Yeah.
And so these folks, I'll get calls from people and they'll tell me, I just want to ask questions. I don't want to give you my name. I don't want to give you any information. And I'm like, that's fine. You don't have to tell me what your number is. You don't have to tell me what your name is. You don't have to tell me anything. Ask me whatever you want. And just know I'm not going to call you back. If you're interested, you're going to have to call me back. You can literally hear them on the phone breathe a sigh of relief because they've made a couple calls and they've been getting just blitzed.
Yeah.
And Dan, people sell their numbers.
Yeah.
They
Heard about
sell
that.
their numbers. And so then they sell the number to a bunch of other. So, I mean, if you're getting calls from these people that have bought your number just because of your insurance policy or your ability to pay, how possibly can that treatment be viable?
Yeah. It's really predatory.
Super predatory.
Yeah.
And this is why, I mean, how the hell do you talk about this stuff without being kind of like, oh my gosh, what's going on?
Yeah, it's hard to discuss these issues without calling out or making a lot of the industry feel called out because, frankly, many of them are doing a lot of stuff wrong. And, I think that's why we've seen segments like John Oliver's come out. That's why we've seen legal action in some states. Florida has been a hotspot for that lately with the Sober Home Task Force. They are really, it's gotten so out of hand that it needs to stop. It needs to change. And yeah, the government is state and federal government are starting to crack down on this stuff. So that's good.
It is good. And there's 17 bills right now facing the legislature in California. So there's some good things on the horizon. And it really comes down to protecting consumers. I mean, if you really were to sort of look at this, you remember when there was all the nursing care fraud and there was all the Medicare fraud, and basically there were people getting abused in the late stages of their life when they were in a vulnerable, essentially disabled position, just elderly.
Yeah.
And the feds had to come in and say, no. We're going to protect these people. We're going to protect this class. We're going to protect our citizens. Here's the rules that we're going to put in place because those consumers didn't have advocacy and they didn't have a voice. Well, we're in that right now. Essentially, this sounds crazy, but addicts are being preyed upon, not just by drug dealers. At this stage, they're essentially being preyed upon by providers.
Right.
It is mind-boggling and intensely aggravating. And that all being said, I really think, and this is something that is absolutely true in my experience, when a family member calls One Method Center, they speak to me or another executive. They don't talk to a call center. They don't talk to somebody in a boiler room off-site that's answering phone calls to try to get them to us.
Yeah.
They talk to a founder, a clinician, a program director, an executive that's actually going to be involved in the care. That is 100% the antithesis of what takes place in this field.
Yeah.
Does that make everybody bad? No. It just says that there's different ways of doing things. And so when people call us, they feel that, and it helps them to trust the process. And then, again, remember we talked about what's the most important part of intake. The most important part is pre-admission, right? So if your mom sends you to me for treatment, how important it is that she trusts the treatment when you get to the treatment center and you say, I friggin' hate this place, let me go home.
Yeah, absolutely.
Those boundaries got to be in place. And she's like, sweetheart, I'm willing to pay for this treatment. You got to stick it out, stick and stay. And, you can't manipulate and triangulate and get out of there. And the end result is that you get the help that you need.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot of,
you're a knucklehead, but
thanks. Yeah. So I think that covers just about everything, things to look out for, questions to ask. What else do you think parents or loved ones or even people that are suffering need to know about how to find a rehab and how to find someone that will actually help them? I guess we haven't talked about one thing, which is how to find the right place, so you're kind of stuck with two tasks. It's one, making sure that the place you're talking to isn't a complete scam. But after that, out of all the places that are good, how do you find the right fit for you and your specific needs? Because I imagine it's different for each person, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's where that initial, if you can do an assessment.
The assessment.
Yeah. I mean, if you can talk with someone prior to going to treatment, then what you're going to get is one of the pillars of an evidence-based practice. Because one of the pillars, you got to assess the situation. If you don't have the assessment, which is, again, that's what intake is supposed to be. When someone calls One Method, they're supposed to get a comprehensive evaluation where we assess whether or not they're appropriate for care with us. You can do that on your own without calling us. I mean, they could call you and you could assess and evaluate the situation based on your knowledge of the field. So that assessment is critical. And then the other part is, just because the website says it and just because the person on the phone says it, ask them to put it in writing.
Yeah.
If you know what you need and you need individual sessions and they say that they're going to provide 4 per week, just have them email that to you. It doesn't even have to be like something formal, a document that's signed by attorneys and all that. Just have them email that to you, because then you can, bring that up when they don't provide it and say, this is what you said. If you don't provide me with what you said, I'm going to have to find another program. And so protect yourself as a consumer until we can protect you as a government, essentially.
Nice. I love it. That's all great information. So let's see. We should also cover, so if they want to talk to you, we'll leave your contact information in the show notes. As you mentioned, you guys do free treatment assessments to help people figure out the right option for them. Is that right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And also, I'm always available, and the team at Recovery X is always available. We'll hook you up with, somebody who's the right match for your specific case, whether that's Cassidy and One Method Center or somebody else that we've talked to. We've got a very wide network and can send you in the right direction. We also should mention the free options. I know there's a lot of free state and federal options. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I'll help you if you don't mind. I'll send you an email and I'll put some stuff in the show notes. But essentially, SAMHSA, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, is a government entity that sort of has access by very simple online searches to all the free programs all across the United States. And so, in a crisis, you can go to this website. I'll give you the link. They can put in their zip code, and it'll bring up a list of really all the free state and federally funded programs in their area. So that's a resource. Obviously, if you don't have any resources, you don't have any insurance, you don't have any money, pretty much you should call, and whomever says you can come here, I would go there, right? Like,
yeah,
it's going to be a little bit of a different situation. But if you have any financial resources or an insurance benefit that, covers in-network or out-of-network or both types of care, it's important to know that you can probably get the best treatment for you available. And knowing how to figure out what is the best includes kind of asking some of the questions that we've talked about here.
Nice. It's all great information. I really hope this helps some parents and some loved ones and some people suffering from addiction out there. So I want to let everyone that's watching know that if you have any questions, you can just comment on wherever you're watching this video, or hit us up on Facebook, and we'll get them answered by Cassidy or myself. Cassidy, anything else that you think we should cover before we sign off?
No, I just want to say thank you. I mean, I really think that, again, I know it's kind of singing your praises, but Dan, what you're doing is extraordinary. I'm just saying it's extraordinary, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, Recovery X, we're really, we saw the lack of information that was out there, and having tried to put some of my own friends and loved ones into treatment and running up against these same issues, that was what really kicked this off and inspired it. So I'm just happy to be able to give back to people that are still going through it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and thank you very much for helping out with that. It goes a long way. All right, brother. So for everyone watching, thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to drop us a comment or a message, like I said. And yeah, we'll see you next time. If you have any questions, reach out, and we'll leave everything in the show notes, so you can contact Cassidy at One Method Center or myself and the Recovery X team. All right. Thank you so much, Cassidy. See you later.
Bye for now.
Bye.